Chapter 22. The volcano erupts. Um, and what was funny made doing during that awful summer of 2007 as the mortgage market descended into utter chaos and the decades of grounded police driving big upper foolish mistakes and misguided beliefs and come together to create financial volcano that was begin to easter. Birkin, perhaps? No, Fanny was blotting its back. Fanny at that point held or warranting almost $2.7 trillion in mortgage, Friday another $2 trillion. Unlike John Spolson or Andrew DeFlow, they had no ability to short the housing market. Their singular rule, set out in the charter that had long given them their advantage over their market competitors, was to support the housing market and help the country's citizens achieve the American dream. Yet the fact that the housing market was in decline instead of scaring the GSAs as it should have was such a tremendous optimism. Subprime lenders were shutting down. Wall Street was afraid to securities mortgage. Banks were reluctant to make new housing loans, and since they could no longer sell them Wall Street, only mortgage guaranteed by the were view of the safe now to be sold and securitized at long last. They were banked in the river assets. The country needed Fanny and Friday truly needed them in a way it hadn't. It just thought this was an opportunity for these guys to demonstrate their value to the world. Fanny Sue and Maud would later say. Politician housing advocates, fashion think tanks types were they were all suddenly rally around Fanny's my and Freddie Mac. Democrats like Senators Charlie Summers of New York and Chris Down of Connecticut, both hit ranking members of the Senate Banking Committee were pushing our the expand to powers. Republicans weren't for begin. This is what you're here for. Much recalls regulators of both parties telling him when the Bush White House was backing away from its long-standing hostility toward the GSAs, no matter how so much might be ideologically opposed to Fanny and Freddie. It was hard to go after them. They went their way, only think propping up the housing market. The political environment was where invite you in can be part of the solutions. But later recalled by the end of August 2007, Fanny stock, which had dropped to a low of 48 in the spring of 2005, was almost back to its 2004 peak of $70. Politicians increasingly applaud for GSS growth. Morgan Stanley analyst Keith Posner that while housing market stability is in the process on dropping the anti-just ideology that has held sway in recent years. That summer, Mott defined the company's strategic plan for the next 4 years. He had started in his ace. He pointed out that over the last 10 years, Phineas Smith's credit loss had amounted to $3.1 billion compared to profits of the 44.2 billion. We have a great opportunity by taking more credit risks on the balance sheet. He called it on the company to get deeper into segments where we only have scratched the surface, meaning, of course, subprime mortgage. Over the years, whenever Alan Greenspan and others and criticized the It was the interest rate risk they worried about. Fannie and Freddie's were who they believed that it would take only one big holding stake and a sudden shift in interest rates to bring about catastrophe. But they had never focused on credit risks, the risks that the mortgage funnies and Freddie's granted out or held would default. Maybe it was because they had been a shoveling over the years held to credit risks in the system, from subprime originators to AG, that they never saw incoming with Fannie and Freddie Hader. Thus it was that in 2007, Fannie and Freddie Wool had $1 billion in net new mortgage debt to their books, debt that will win up highly destructive. They will continue to buy and guarantee mortgage well to into 2008, and thus it was that he just would lumber slowly but inevitably toward a cliff they didn't see. The financial crisis came on in fits and starts, and all the Wild Fannie Mae and Freddie Macs were accumulations. The very mortgage risks the world case the long dormant volcano to finally erupt. With all the problems he was facing, Fannie and Freddie were holding high hand Paulson list of priorities. As Treasury Secretary, he kept in close touch with all the Wall Street team. He knew exactly what was going on. In his memoir, he describes a diner in June 2007 with a handful of Wall Street chain fans, including Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, um, Lloyd Bankley of Goldman Sachs, and George Price, the CEO of Citigroup. All were concerned with excessive risk taking in the markets and appalled by the erosion of the underwriting standards. He was surprised, he added, asked whether, given the competitive pressure, there wasn't a role for regulators to tamp some of the riskier practices. Basically, he asked, isn't there something you can do to order you not to take out of these risks? Lejul saw the German government bail-out. In early August, American Home Mortgage Investment Corporation, which was unable to sell its commercial paper, filed for bankruptcy a few weeks later. Countrywide had to drown out that line of credit, signaling it was in trouble. On August 21, in actions for a week, Treasury bills nearly failed because the demand was so massive in overwhelming the dealers. In mid-September, the Bearside Bank, Northern Rock, had to be rescued by the Bank of England. The banks were all announcing hot write-downs while frantically trying to raise additional capital, something Paulson was pushing them to do, but the new capital was quickly overwhelmed by yet more losses. The ships that some banks had used to offload debt and lower these capital requirements were foundering, and as the money market funds began dumping their commercial paper, Treasury came up with a plan to create super SIP, which the banks would fund that would buy the asset from the individual SIPs. The plan failed out. Um, Citi, which had been the most promiscuous user of SIPs, had to put the SIP asset bank on its balance sheets at exactly the wrong time, and they eventually contribute to its many billions of dollars on great sounds. Paulson and his staff were frantically busy trying to come up with solution and step of disaster. His retail's energy went into overdrive. today's idea wasn't necessarily consistent with yesterday's idea, but then the problems were unprecedented. There was no manual for what to do when you're the Treasury Secretary trying to prevent a financial crisis. As the year were on, he and his small team at Treasure became a joke that they felt like Butch Cassidy and the students' kid. They were being pressured and cornered, and even thought they'd come out with guns blazing. They couldn't ever seem to get out in front of the problem. Thought he was Bush's appointment, Paulson had to patience for the White House. Only were his words against the yes, they were flawed institutions that were far too big and quite possibly for possessed system bricks. But Paulson was a pragmatist. He dealt with things as they were. Fanny and Freddie's weren't going away. They were a problem that needed to be managed. Besides, they were only partly to blame for the monsters they become. This was created by Congress, he'd say. When he did focus on Fanny and Freddie, he didn't gnash his teeth at the moral hazard they posed. Rather, he worked to reduce that moral hazard. One step was to get Fannie and Freddie's new regulators. It was no secret what Opio was outmatched practically from the moment he was named Treasury Secretary. Paulson had worked to push out legislation to create a new regulator that would have real authority to set capital requirements, conduct serious audits, and even if it came to that, going down to get such legislation, he had to compromise with Democrats. Paulson had no problem with that, but it was anathema to White House staff. Paulson was perfectly willing to override them and go to President Bush directly, which he did. In 2006, he began working with the Democrats to get legislation that would create a better, tougher regulator. The effort ran into congressional red blocs. Fannie's enemies, including in White House enemies, started speculating that Paulson was it in the tank for Fannie because it was a big client of Goldman's. Actually, it was a big client of every firm on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs board member Jim Johnson, a typical charge when had been the chair of the compensations committee when Paulson was CEO and had helped set his pay and so on. The second step Paulson took was to urge the GSA to raise capital, the same way he was urging all the big firms that raise capital. He liked to say that he'd never seen a CEO of financial institutions get fired for having too much capital, and ended. They just didn't raise additional capital, selling a combined in equity and preferred stock, but buying was dropped in the ocean for Fannie and Freddie's by 2008. The two companies held a total $84 billion in capital, less than 2% of what was, by that point, a combined $5.3 trillion in mortgage they owned or guaranteed, even more than the banks. Fannie and Freddie could not afford major write-downs. There was absolutely no margin for error, yet Fannie and Freddie were taking write-downs. In February 2008, they announced their 2007 earnings but lost no money, $2.1 billion in the case of Fannie Mae, while Freddie Mac lost $3.1 billion, its first annual loss ever. The reason was deteriorating mortgage, yet at the same time they were taking on more and more risk because nobody else could or would. By early 2008, Fannie and Freddie's were buying for out of every 5 U.S. mortgage doubled their market share from 2 years earlier. In May February, President Bush signed a law that included a provision to raise the size of the jumbo mortgage Fannie's and Freddie's schools boy from in high-cost areas, a stunning, unnecessary increase that was supported by both Greg, the Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Republican John Bonner, the House Minority Leader. Paulson opposed the increase. It was his son Jim Lockhart, a Yale fraternity buddy of Bush, who had become the chairman of OPIUM, told Congress the GS had become the dominant funding mechanism for the entire mortgage system in these troubling times. In doing so, they have been reducing risks in the market but concentrate mortgage risk on themselves.